LTCM's portfolio, the New York Fed's leaders sprang into action. The fear in the New York Fed's President William McDonough's words was that LTCM's exposures were so vast and so opaque that its failure could trigger a chain reaction that would bring the entire financial system to a grinding halt. Markets would, he said, possibly cease to function for a period of 1 or more days and maybe longer. The New York Fed's answer to this problem tells us a lot about its proximity to market actors, including how that proximity can give it credibility the other governmental actors don't have. The answer at the New York Fed was not to release Federal Reserve money into the financial system. The answer was to release Federal Reserve conference rooms. Over several tense days, the New York Fed used its conference rooms and moral suasion to convince a great circle of revival banks and brokers, including many over whom the Fed had exactly zero regulatory authority to lend money to a competitor. The failure to act would not result in any fine or jail sentence or any other kind of governmental coercion, but the collapse of the financial system is also a classic collective action problem, where individual actors could not resolve a problem by acting independently, but could do so through coordinated action, and it took this action unliterally. The Fed Chair Alan Greenspan was not on the front lines of this invocation of the New York Fed's soft power. In fact, just weeks before, he had already assured a congressional hearing that hedge funds were not his concern, nor the concern of any other regulator. Hedge funds are strongly regulated by those who lend money, Greenspan has said. The New York Fed was the coordinator. It provided the moral heft of a regulatory presence that had no basis in law. It solved the collective action problem and spread the financial markets that might have been an early cataclysm. The example shows the power of the Fed's unique regulatory suasion. With so much ego and so much money involved, LTCM, while not exactly a household name, is a story that many know. There is a second example, though, that is much more obscure, but not less important. Just a few years from the LTCM, the New York Fed President Timothy Geithner discovered that the process by which the financial markets recorded their trades in derivatives was hopelessly outdated and completely opaque. Traders would enter into these complex contracts over the phone, write their positions on scraps of paper, and then move on to the next kill. The back office, quotes, was then in charge of sorting through the loose papers and trying to figure out who sold what to whom. The problem was again in the nature of these trades. Derivatives and contingent contracts, they are bets between people about the change in some future event. For example, the price of oil, the level of interest rates, or default of Fortune 500 company. If that event occurs, then the party that lost the bet has to pay up. But what if the parties remember the terms of the trade differently? What if the details on one end of the recorded according to the one price point, but a different price point on the other? What if one or both the counterparties pledges the value of the contract to another party altogether? Question. These were the problems that faced the derivatives markets in 2005 through 2007. Alan Greenspan would later call it 21st century industry, relying on 19th century practices. Because the trading system was all on paper, routed through back offices with no clear way of knowing the terms of the contracts or even the identity of the ultimate counterparties, even a small financial crisis could become much bigger simply because there wasn't an organized way to handle these contracts to give them a sense of a scope of this problem. The total value of all the contracts in the global derivatives market in June 2007, shout out June, around the time that Geithner discovered this problem, was $516 trillion fucking dollars. That's unreal. That's unreal. $516 trillion. What the fuck? That's not a typo, they said. That's not a fucking typo. Alright, trillion, not billion, by comparison. Global GDP, meaning all the wealth in the world generated in a year, in about the same time was $50 trillion. $50 trillion. A failure to understand who owes whom what is the setup for a financial crisis. As one person close to the problem said, trying to figure it all out would be like trying to untangle a vat of uncooked spaghetti. And I'm not fucking untangling no vats of uncooked spaghetti, man. Because you won't do it. It's impossible. That's why he made that comparison. Cook your spaghetti like 20-30 minutes. Make sure that shit's done. Once again, the New York Fed intervened. Once again, it did not regulate, legislate, or litigate. God damn. It threw neither money nor threats at the problem. Once again, most of the participants were not under the New York Fed's regulatory purview. Once again, the problem was solved by rounding everyone up in the New York Fed's conference rooms. Gethner and his associates were able to find a better resolution to the process by which derivatives are recorded. According to Gethner, this was the perfect problem for the New York Fed. This was not a problem the market could solve on its own. He wrote, quote, "It wouldn't make sense for one firm to upgrade its back office operations, address the backlogs of unconfirmed trades, and invest in electronic trading unless all the major derivatives dealers did the same," end quote. The New York Fed had a solution, quote, "We decided to try to induce all of them to do it together," end quotes. This view of the New York Fed role in the markets is not an argument about regulation, but because regulation is not what accomplishes these goals. It is an argument about coordination, and when the solution is one that benefits business that are nevertheless too unlikely to build it on their own, the New York Fed at its best, and the Fed chair again, wasn't really involved. When Gethner sought Greenspan's permission to begin this course, the chair was pleased to consent. "That's what you're supposed to do," he benevolently explained. It's like I'm doing chewing tobacco, the way I have to spit pronouncing these words. I swear to God, sometimes I don't understand it. Like I just need to be salivating 24/7. Pavlov dog out here. Alright, the very proximity and confidence that the problem of capture. The very proximity and confidence of the private market actors have in opening their books to the New York Fed and trusting it to solve these thorny systemic problems also exposes the process by which the worldviews of private bankers and central bankers begin to converge. Over time, the New York Fed and others within the Board of Governors and other reserve banks become, in a word, quote, captured. That's a fighting word. Almost an accusation that the Federal Reserve's officials are corrupt. A standard definition of a capture, quote, after all, describes it's a process by which regulation is consistently or repeatedly directed from one public interest to the next interest of the regulated industry by the intent of the action of the industry itself. Making accusation against policymakers at the Fed appears to be a claim that they are mere puppets by strings of the powerful market participants who want to bend the Fed to their own purposes. But this definition is too sure-footed. Corruption and capture aren't the same concepts. An economist, Luigi Zingales, has written, if regulatory capture was just due to illegal behavior, it would be easier to fight. The problem is that the ideology that animates many of these commercial bankers, traders, hedge fund managers, and other market participants in the same one that the New York Fed. Perhaps regulatory capture is the wrong term, because it focuses on the final actions of the regulators in the New York Fed purpose. Others purpose cognitive capture, quotes, or cultural capture, quotes, which focus more on the upstream problem of insiders and outsiders at the Federal Reserve sharing a worldview that leads to significant blind spots. There is strong evidence that the New York Fed and the other reserve banks share those blind spots. As they share those ideologies, it leads to a thorny question. Are the New York Fed and the other Federal Reserve banks in fact pursuing supervisory policies at the expense of society and in favor of the private banks they regulate because they share a common particular worldview. Question. This is a difficult question to answer with empirical certainty, but there is a strong evidence that many of the Fed policymakers have grown increasingly close to the bankers they regulate. Most obviously is through their legal compelled physical proximity in the boardrooms of the reserve banks. For example, during the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis, the New York Fed President Timothy Geithner's picks for his board were the CEOs of the major banks that received not just direct financial lifelines, but constant insights about how the Fed's thinking about the nature of the crisis. During our memorable meeting March 2008, when the crisis was becoming very real for the Feds and bankers alike, Geithner recalls a team of the best economists at the political New York Fed. They gave a presentation to the board of the potential losses ahead for the bank based in part on outcomes from recent recessions. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of banking juggernaut J.P. Morgan Chase, laughed at them. He told them to throw out their historically based estimates and triple their projected losses. That's fascinating. About this exchange is not the exact observation that the private banker might know more than the Fed economist about projected losses. It's that the private banker was receiving this briefing as part of a formal governance of the Federal Reserve Banks in the first place. It's not just the governance of the Federal Reserve Banks that compels this proximity. Recall the discussion of the cigar chase in Chapter 7 about the problem of supervising the banks. One such example doesn't condemn the entire institution, of course, but the problem is that the New York Fed uneasiness with bucking the banks, not unique to cigar case, because I'd rather be fucking the banks. The New York Fed was often ignored problematic behavior of affirmatively lobbied against proposals for change. When the Fed's Board of Governors and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation sought to finalize the rules limiting how much debt would the world's largest bank could carry, arguably one of the most important regulatory changes to follow up the 2008 financial crisis, the New York Fed President William Dudley was, by his own admission, the courier of the bank's arguments. That such regulation, almost uniformly praised by economists and politicians on the left and right, would somehow limit the Fed's ability to conduct monetary policy, while Dudley's argument against he is said that merely meant to convey industry concerns. A curious point, since industry insiders have been anything but silent on their opposition to these rules, failed to carry the day. It did not succeed in delaying the implementation of the rule by several months. Geithner, too, admitted as a New York Fed president he didn't make a regulatory change a priority, in part out of the fear the banks would protest. For example, the New York Fed failed to police risky behavior in the mortgage-backed securities markets at the heart of the 2008 financial crisis, as described in Chapter 2. This is the same regulatory effort that Alan Greenspan thwarted. As Geithner wrote in his memoir, Ned Gromlich, a Fed governor in Washington, was already leading a process to examine excesses and abuses in the mortgage business serving lower-income Americans. The problem wasn't that Geithner disputed Gromlich's conclusions. To the contrary, he was impressed by Gromlich's work, and those issues seemed to be getting a fair amount of attention from the Fed in Washington. I didn't want us to be like kid soccer players all swarming around the ball. I wanted us to focus around the systemic vulnerabilities that were getting less attention, starting with our own banks, but looking outside them as well. Geithner, like many New York Fed leaders before him, wasn't as interested in policing Wall Street's bad behavior. He was more interested in solving its collective action problems. Another mechanism through which outside influences come from the private market participants to the Fed is personal. The list of private sector alums in senior leadership positions at the New York Fed is long and storied. Sometimes the connection starts in industry and ends in the New York Fed. In the case with the current New York Fed President William Dudley, Dudley was a managing director at Goldman Sachs for more than 20 years before joining the Fed New York in 2007. Sometimes it moves in the other direction. Gerald Corrigan was an employee and eventually a president of the New York Fed for 20 years and left in 1993 to join Goldman Sachs. The New York Fed provides many useful examples of the location within the Fed where powerful market participants could shape Fed policy, but it is far from the only one, including the question of common personnel. David Mullins is a former vice chair of the Federal Board of Governors, left the board to join the hedge fund, long-term capital management, providing a personal connection to his financial institution whose legal connection to the Fed was virtually non-existent. And former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke announced in April 5, 2015 that he would join the massive hedge fund Citadel LLC, a fund with over $24 billion under management. Bernanke was a sizable income from the book royalties, Speechless, and other sources. Motivations here isn't just money, but the access to power central bankers have inside the Fed, access they can only get from the financial markets. As James Kwok wrote after the Bernanke announcement, when you've been at the helm of the global economy for 8 years, where is it there to go? Where's there to go? Whether the revolving door is a good or bad thing, not the question. The point is that the links forged through the common employment networks is a significant mechanism for the bankers and the other market participants to influence Fed policy, just as bankers have a seat at the table in the boardrooms of the Federal Reserve banks. They have a business card and an alumni network. When the reserve banks or regulated banks are closely aligned. Again, it bears emphasis that the discussion of ideological and cultural capture in the New York Fed and elsewhere within the system does not mean the Fed is corrupt. The coordination function discussed earlier in this chapter yields impressive results. There is almost no doubt, for example, that Gethner's work is simplifying the clearing of derivatives contracts in the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis dampened the consequences of that crisis, but it is not clear that the private actors are incapable of providing function themselves. It may be that after so much of the New York Fed's conference room that they may have to rely on it. These examples in both Fed's regulatory suasion and its cultural and ideological capture demonstrate the influence that private markets participants have been shaping in the space within which the Fed operates. The influential, unavoidable, and the line between paying attention and taking direction is hard to draw. The point is not that the market participants' influence on the Fed is an unmitigated good or evil. It is only to recognize that the influence shapes the Fed's behavior in ways that we must acknowledge and analyze. There are many technical aspects to central banking, but there are many others that require exercise of judgment, informed by ideology. In discerning the nature of the Fed power, knowing the identity of the central banker, including the central banker's market ideologies, including the ways that the central banker will interact with markets and the movements that requires the interaction, will be essential in evaluating the kind of central bankers that banker she will be. The next chapter argues that the legislator made wrong choice. The context of financial regulation and the monetary policy 2015 cannot justify that kind of proximity. The task for discerning the structure the Fed's policy making space in the chapter is so to understand that the market and banker ideology influences the Fed's decision makers. Whether it should do so is a separate question. The Fed and international central bankers is the next subject. By virtue of the size of the American economy, the Federal Reserve is, in the words of the former Fed insider, the closest world has to come a global central bank. But this is not a job that the Fed does alone. The international coordination is at the heart of the modern central banking, particularly in the context of bank regulation and financial stability. Historically, it was international coordination that exacerbated the Great Depression. Liaquat Ahmed's Pulitzer Prize winning book exaggerated only a little in calling the lords of finance the central bankers who broke the world. Their breaking the world occurred through international coordination. International financial regulatory coordination is a fact of life. The reality is that the community of central bankers will influence each other in the actions that they take. That tastes better. It's not bittersweet or sour subliminal. Two examples are useful. The coordinated response to the 2008 crisis through the use of the international swap lines and the coordinated regulatory response after the crisis. Although the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, releases its minutes on a 3-week delay, the full transcripts of its meetings aren't released until 5 years later. In the late 2014, the Fed was in the process of releasing the transcripts of some of the most important meetings during the height of the 2008 financial crisis, giving a window for the first time into the most important decisions central bankers made during that tumultuous time. It is perhaps surprising that so much of those meetings were focused not primarily on domestic considerations, but on international ones. Many of the FOMC meetings at the height of the financial crisis were taking up discussions of international swap agreements, a tool the Fed had used during previous financial crises, but had largely abandoned outside of crisis. Under these swap agreements, the Fed would advance billions of dollars up to foreign central banks at specified exchange rate in return for foreign currency. The point of these swaps was to provide through foreign central banks with dollars, an essential commodity at the time with the U.S. investors were fleeing risky markets elsewhere in their flight to the safety of U.S. government debt. Because the financial crisis was based so much on dollar-based assets, these foreign central banks desperately needed dollars to stay afloat. In that event, the Fed became something of a central bank to the world. It provided the currency that other countries needed to accomplish their own policies. As lenders of last resort, this kind of coordination shaped the Fed's policies throughout the crisis. As the journalist Neil Irwin outlines, the main central bankers of the world were enclosed, sometimes daily contracted as they coordinated policies to ensure maximal efficacy, of their policies. With the Depression era practice of subordinating domestic interests into international coordination was not apparent. In some instances, domestic interests clearly trumped, including the failure of the UK regulators to approve the purchase of Lehman Brothers, the British bank Barclays. There were no question that these central banks were performing on an international stage, working closely together. The struggles of international coordination are even more starkly demonstrated outside the context of crisis. Arguably, the main event in domestic and international bank regulation is capital adequacy regulation, or the rules that govern the mix of equity and debt that a bank must maintain to fund itself. Bankers want to have access to as much debt as possible, but bank critics argue that this addiction to debt is precisely the cause of the financial crisis. In a crisis, debt is always the contagion. Limit the amount of the debt bank can carry on its balance sheet, and you limit the extent of potential crisis. Largely, the reasons of history rules on capital adequacy are set by international agreement. The falls well short of the international treaty, but still sets the stage for domestic adoption. Meeting together in Basel, Switzerland, central bankers joined together within what was originally conceptualized as the Central Bank for Central Bankers. The Bank of International Settlements today, one of the BIS's primary functions, is to coordinate through the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, the so-called Basel Accords. The Basel Accords are political documents, while the BIS and the BCBS employed large technical staffs of economists to test the ideas that undergird the accords. The final documents are made through a political process that reflects the views of bankers, central bankers, and others with enough of the constituency to make their views heard. Some view the entire process as notorious and nefarious, but nothing to fully demonstrate the constraints. The central bankers face not from politicians but from other central bankers as the Basel Accords. They set parameters for domestic adoption. The Dodd-Frank Act, for example, did essentially nothing on capital adequacy. The domestic understanding was what these decisions would be made at Basel. And the regulators would then have the discretion to adopt and adjust the parameters as they arrived. But the starting point for the negotiation would not be in Congress, nor even at the Fed. It would be in Basel, Switzerland. This kind of proximity shared outlook by the common language by discussing problems inevitability that shapes the Fed policy making. But that doesn't mean that the Fed is taking orders from the European Central Bank of Japan or anyone else. It does mean that together international central bankers could shape each other's worldviews, because the work of the central banking requires so much judgment under uncertainty. Understanding where the Fed fits in the wider world helps to explain the Fed's policy judgments come to be. The Fed and the economists. Next subject. The Federal Reserve is the institution that economists built. We have discussed in detail the contributions of politicians like Carter Glass and Woodrow Wilson, the bankers like Paul Warburg and Benjamin Strong, but the ideas that would come to be accepted by all warring factions originated not in the secret meeting on Jekyll Island, but in the journal articles of academic economists. The connection between the Fed and the economist profession has only grown stronger over the course of the century. Over the course of that period, the institution has become the de facto institutional home and government for leading economists. We saw in Chapter 4 the ways the economists function within the Fed. Let us now consider that the way the economists influence Fed policy from the outside. Perhaps the most influential economist to shape the policies of the Federal Reserve System was Milton Friedman. Friedman was one of the founders of the view within the economics of monetarism, that doctrine that, among the other tenets, held inflation always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But differently, the role of the central banks was not second-guess private markets, nor to support government's fiscal policies, but to target the quantity of money in the economy. And he had minded economists, had preached his gospel of monetarism since the 1950s, largely to no avail. All of this changed with the rise of Paul Volcker. In a letter of congratulations for Volcker's appointment to the Fed chair, Friedman warned him about there has almost never been both a greater need or greater opportunity for the Federal Reserve System to render service to the nation's courageous and steady policy of monetary restraint, experienced gradually and moderately. Friedman also made clear where he stood. As you know, I do not believe that the system could rise to the challenge without major changes in its method of operation. My very best wishes to you for success in pushing those changes in all those results. Friedman blamed Arthur Burns for the inflation, for failing to control the money supply. Friedman's solution to the gospel, quotes, itself, as it was called, was this change in operating procedures, a change away from targeting interest rates to targeting the quantity of money in the economy and letting the interest rates go where they would. This was considered heresy. Yeah, fuck it. Most central bankers in the anathema to Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, Volcker was not a monetarist, but in this view, the psychology of the market favored a drastic change from what had become before. In a consequential meeting on October 6, 1979, the FOMC decided to make the dramatic, quote, change in techniques the Federal Reserve had gone monetarist, it stayed there while interest rates soared to over 20% in nominal terms. The Fed would not return in targeting interest rates until 1993. While Friedman's name was not mentioned in those early meetings, his influence was elsewhere. Volcker kept Friedman in his thoughts and on his schedule. Friedman had powered allies in Washington, especially after the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and while Friedman did not get everything he wanted out of the Fed, he wanted to replace the Fed with a monetary policy rule that would transparently hew to be a fixed gross in money. Whatever the economic climate, he was able to change without any action. In Congress, the way the Fed did business for a decade, Friedman is hardly the only influential economist to shape Fed policy through blunt force of ideas. John B. Taylor, the Stanford economist, whose simple monetary policy rule that regulates interest rates, inflation, employment, and the outgap of GDP targets an economic performance, has dominated discussions of Fed policy inside and outside the Fed in the last 20 years. And especially the crisis. And Michael Woodford, Columbia economist who has contributed key papers on the principles of forward guidance of the political announcement of future policy intentions, had shaped the debates of unconventional monetary policy. Because of the nature of the Fed, economists shaped the content of the Fed's policies by a combination of intellectual content and the central bankers' own ideological predilections. This is once again why the identity of central bankers matters so much. Just as senators spar with the judicial appointees over the latter views, bidding on you fucks. Alright. So judicial appointees over the latter's views on, say, abortion or the death penalty, they should expect and hopefully receive insight into what the central bankers' views are on such ideas as the monetary policy rules, forward guidance, and the other theoretical and empirical components of influential topics in macroeconomics. These ideas did not hatch from thin air. They were conceived and written by economists, and they shape the way the Fed's central bankers think of themselves and their policy-making role. Next subject, the political scientist Peter Hall, describing monetary policy making in Britain, called the process social learning, quote, in this